Tonight, we will not visit the great domes of the Pantheon, nor walk along the smooth cobblestones that emperors walked, nor sit and watch the golden light of the evening fall over the ancient Roman Forum. No, tonight we will enter a different part of ancient Rome, the part that is not in textbooks, the part that the tours pass by, the part that is buried beneath the marble and the glorious praise. It is the part that has blood, dust, ash, and screams swallowed up in silence. Rome gave us law, architecture, philosophy, and sewers, but it also left us another legacy, a treasure trove of punishments designed as works of art, carried out as religious rituals, and remembered not for their justice, but for their horror. Rome did not just kill you, they did it on purpose. There was a plot, there was an audience, and sometimes there was a soundtrack. Nothing about death was accidental. Every drop of blood, every hiccup, every ragged breath has its place in the symphony of imperial power. If you thought punishment was simply a whip or a chain, forget it. Rome was not simple. They didn't just want you to die. They wanted everyone to know you were dying, and why you deserved to die. And most of all, they wanted you to know it every moment until there was nothing left to know. Before we begin this journey into the darkness, if you're the type of person who likes slow, dark, somewhat bizarre, and very real stories, and before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fun to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for a gentle hum. And so let us journey together tonight. We begin with a pit, and a girl, a virgin, a symbol, one who has no right to make mistakes. She is a Vestal, the one chosen to keep the sacred flame of Vesta burning, and the empire from falling. But then she falls in love. And in Rome, loving the wrong person can be a sin great enough to bury you in the ground, while you're still breathing. In ancient Rome, the Vestal virgins were more than just priestesses. They were the spiritual guardians of the nation. If the sacred fire of Vesta, the symbol of life, of the state, of order, went out, Rome believed that civilization itself would collapse. So they took prepubescent girls, trained them in silence, and placed in their hands a task too heavy for a child to comprehend: to keep the fire, to keep virtue, and to keep things from falling apart. 30 years, not to love, not to touch, not to make mistakes. But humans were humans even when cloaked in ritual. When a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, Rome saw it not as a personal mistake, but as a divine bomb exploding in the heart of the Senate. And when that happened, the punishment was not flogging, not decapitation. The Romans had a small problem with shedding the blood of priestesses, because it would offend the gods. So what did they do? They dug a hole, not big, just enough, a vertical room of dirt. They put the girl in the hole. They put a small oil lamp with her, some dry bread, a jug of water, and sometimes a small statue to give the impression that she was not completely alone. Then they sealed the lid. No knives, no swords, no blood, just dirt, and time, and darkness. Can you imagine that? The feeling when the air begins to thicken, when the light from the oil lamp grows dim from lack of oxygen. When your hand runs up the dirt wall and you realize there is no escape. When the bread becomes meaningless, and the water, even though it is plentiful, will not save. A slow, silent judgment, but deeper than any scream. Rome, in the strangest way, found the perfect loophole in its own moral system. No bloodshed, no desecration of the holy. But still, it was remembered. The price of sin was deep to the ground. And the men? Those who had committed the crime with her? Not buried, but not spared either. They were often beaten to death in public, a quicker, but noisier death. While the girl, who was called the Flame of Vesta, was left in silence, so that the last flame within her would die out without anyone witnessing. The point is, being a Vestal was a huge honor. They had the front seats at ceremonies, the right to pardon condemned prisoners with a word, to travel in their own carriages through the city. They had everything except the right to love, and if the heart strayed once, it all ended in an upright grave, with bread and a dim lamp. There was a famous Vestal named Cornelia. When she was sentenced, she said, "Does Caesar think I have had sex with a god?" No mortal has touched me. Proud last word. But useless. In Rome, sharp words cannot cut through protocol. And protocol is unforgiving. So next time you feel your boss is a little harsh, remember that at least he doesn't want you buried alive because you texted at the wrong time. In ancient Rome, breaking discipline wasn't a warning. It was sealed away, along with you and a dying lamp. If you thought being buried alive was the limit, wait until you see what Rome did to its parricide. In a culture that worshipped family to the point of being a god, there was nothing worse than betraying the one who gave you birth. And so the punishment had to be unimaginably bad. Not just death. No, for the Romans, you weren't just removed from life, you were thrust into intentional chaos. They called it pena culiae, the punishment of the sack. But this wasn't just any sack. This was a leather-made nightmare, sewn shut with the worst that nature had to offer. First, the guilty man's hands were bound, a final reminder that it was he who had used them to destroy the most sacred of bonds. Then he was sewn inside a huge sack. Sounds nice, right? But here's the fun part. He didn't go in there alone. Joining him at the bottom of the river were 4 companions. A dog, a monkey, a rooster, and a snake. It seemed like a bizarre riddle, but it was actually a chillingly harsh symbolism. The dog was a symbol of family and loyalty, which he had betrayed. The monkey represented chaos and instinct. The snake was deceit. And the rooster, perhaps a call of impending death, or simply Rome's fondness for adding a little noise at the last moment. When everything was in order, man and beast, the sack was tied, lifted, and thrown into the river. No swords, no blood, just barks, screams, hisses, and the sound of human bodies hitting animal skins and then water. Imagine being in a pitch-black space, being kicked in the head by a monkey, while a snake slithered across your back, a dog clawed frantically at your chest, and a chicken pecked wildly at your legs. That was not punishment. It was a psychological drama with you as the lead, and no second act. No one is really sure why the Romans chose the animals they did, but the theory is that each one was a personification of sin, as if Rome wanted you dead in your act, turning the sin into living flesh, and forcing you to live with it for the rest of your life. Fortunately, if you can use that word, this punishment was rarely used. It was not common, but was revived festively whenever an emperor had a taste for drama or needed to set an example. On such occasions, Rome didn't just kill a man. It sent a message that fatherhood is not a choice, it's a bond. And if you break it, you won't die alone. You will die amid the claws, fangs, roars, and silent judgment of the Tiber. So next time you and Dad disagree about dinner, remember, in ancient Rome, there was a time when just one wrong look could have ended your journey in a sack with legs, feathers, a tongue, and teeth. When we think of crucifixion, most of us picture a wooden cross, a body held high in front of a crowd, blood flowing from the wrists and ankles, and pain that stretches into hours, even days. But ancient Rome, as always, was not content with the mundane. They didn't just execute, they engineered pain. And when a death became too familiar, they innovated it. And so came the special version, upside-down crucifixion. Yes, upside down, not standing, hanging upside down. As if normal death wasn't hard enough, Rome turned it around, literally. The body was nailed head down, ankles pinned to the wood, the entire weight on the clenched hands, blood pouring down into the head, pressing into the brain, making all sensations blurry, dull. This wasn't just pain. It was a remix of pain, where the victim died slowly through a series of strange physical pressures. Reverse suffocation, disorientation, and every blood vessel bursting under the pressure of blood pooling under the skin of the face. You weren't just exposed. You were turned upside down, literally and metaphorically. This method wasn't for petty thieves or ordinary troublemakers. It was for those whom the authorities wanted to emphasize, clearly, that this was an unnatural death for the unforgivable. The rebels, the defiants of order, the ones who dared to raise their heads, Rome would turn them upside down. The most famous case, St. Peter. According to tradition, when he was sentenced to crucifixion under Nero, he asked to be crucified upside down, as he was unworthy to die the way his Lord did. Profoundly humbling act. And Rome, a well-oiled machine never one to miss an opportunity for theatricality, readily agreed. Not only did they agree, they turned that plea into a perfect spectacle of twisted submission. And then, ironically, the upside-down cross, once a symbol of piety, was later turned into a symbol of the devil in popular culture, appropriated by metal bands and horror movies, distorting every layer of meaning. Rome would have been pleased. They always loved to see symbols turned upside down. But remember, for Rome, this was never about religion, or morality, or forgiveness. It was about the message, a wooden and iron exclamation point in the middle of the square. A message from the empire to everyone watching. Resist us? We will crucify you, upside down, so that all will see you were turned upside down until your last breath. So the next time you find yourself spinning around in work, life, or endless meetings, take heart. At least you're not hanging, head down, blood rushing into your brain, while a crowd watches and remembers your death as a living history lesson. If you think punishment in ancient Rome was reserved for rebels, slaves, or poor believers, think again. In Rome, even soldiers were not exempt. In fact, they were punished more severely because they knew the rules. And when an army failed the Romans, the empire didn't just want to teach them a lesson. They wanted to leave a mark on their memory. In blood. Welcome to decimation, not the total annihilation that the name suggests. It was worse because it left the 9 surviving to see the rest wiped out. Here's how it worked. If a Roman unit made a particularly bad mistake, like running away from the enemy, mutinying, or worse, failing in the eyes of their superiors, the commander could order a decimation. The entire unit lined up, quietly, and then 1 out of every 10 was drawn by lot. The chosen one wasn't lucky. He wasn't executed by his enemies. No public hanging. No public beheading. He was beaten to death by the 9 men who had shared the camp's bread, wine, and banter the night before. With sticks. With stones. With anything that could kill without breaking the law. If you think killing your comrade is unthinkable, imagine the opposite. Refusing to kill and taking the next position. No one was safe from a decimation. That was the lesson. That was organized cruelty. Rome understood. When fear comes from within the ranks, enemies without stand a chance. When you fear the hand next to you, you dare not turn and run. And don't think that surviving the decimation was a privilege. The 9 who killed their comrades will not get a pat on the back. They were banished from the fortress, forced to sleep outdoors as outcasts, eat cheaper rations, and march on with the ghost of their actions hanging over their shoulders. Rome never let you forget who you had just killed. One of the most famous decimations was after the slave rebellion led by Spartacus. General Crassus, one of the 3 men who formed a powerful alliance with Caesar and Pompey, ordered the decimation of one of his units after a humiliating defeat. Not because the strategy was wrong, but because he needed to restore fear. Because in Rome, respect was not built on words. It was built on dead soldiers and covered with the ashes of sin. So the next time your boss mentions team building or enhancing team spirit, smile. At least you won't have to draw lots to know whether you'll die today or beat the person sitting next to you to death. Not all punishments in Rome were loud, bloody, or public. Some were quieter, more subtle, and therefore more gruesome. Rome, as always, knew how to exploit silence as a tool of punishment, not by forbidding you from speaking, but by making your every movement a trap. Welcome to the heretic's fork, a torture device that was disconcertingly simple, but terrifyingly effective. It was essentially a small metal rod, with 2 prongs on each end, like a forked, turned-back trident. One end was pressed firmly against your upper chest. The other, sharp and cold, was placed just below your chin. And the whole thing was attached to your neck with a sturdy strap, like a collar of despair. It had no spikes, no hooks, no saws. It wasn't designed to kill you. It was designed to bind you to yourself. You couldn't bow your head. No nod. No tilt. Any movement, even reflex, causes one of the spikes to dig into your flesh. Not deep enough to kill, but enough to make you remember you forgot you had it on. Sounds easy? Imagine standing like that for hours, days. with your entire neck as taut as a bowstring, unable to relax. No yawning, no sighing, no bowing in prayer, just tension, and the constant presence of the two steel spikes waiting for you to tire. Who is forced to wear it? Those who say things they shouldn't. Heretics, blasphemers, denials of the gods, or simply annoying those in authority before breakfast. Maybe you ask the wrong question at a ceremony. Maybe you whisper a skeptical word into the wrong person's ear. And then, the next morning, you wake up with metal piercing your skin and a clear message. Keep your head straight. Sometimes the fork is engraved with tiny Latin letters, a permanent confession pressed into the throat. I am guilty. I deny the faith. I am the word that should not be. And every time you forget, every time your instinct makes you bend, the device you wear reminds you with a small prick, patient, steady, unforgiving. The fork doesn't leave a big scar. It doesn't need to, because it doesn't want to destroy your body. It wants to empty your spirit, turn you into a stationary landmark where any notion of movement is banished. No blood, no screams, just a quiet collapse, something Rome loves above all else. So the next time you try to hold back a sneeze in a tense meeting or stifle a yawn in a silent crowd, imagine doing it for 3 days straight, with a rusty fork waiting under your chin. In Rome, silence isn't golden. It's steel, and it stabs. In the modern world, when someone betrays you, you can unfollow them on social media, quietly delete them from a group chat, or, if you're really pissed, block them without a word. But in ancient Rome, that gentle approach was not in the dictionary. Here, betrayal wasn't met with silence. It was thrown off a cliff. Welcome to Tarpeian Rock, an 80-foot-tall boulder on the slopes of Capitoline Hill, right next to the seat of power of the Roman Republic. It's an inconspicuous cliff to look at in passing, but it serves as the empire's permanent unfriend button. Not with words, with gravity. If you're a traitor, a liar to the Senate, a corrupt person who's made the city tremble, Rome won't argue with you. They'll strip you of your shirt, chain you to the ground, and march you across the square, past the silent or screaming crowds, to the edge of the rock. There will be no judges, no excuses, just the wind, and stones, and a push. Its name, oddly enough, comes from another tale of betrayal. Tarpeia, a Roman maiden, had betrayed Rome, opening the gates to the Sabines in exchange for what they wore on their left arms. She thought it was a golden bracelet. They thought it was a shield, and they crushed her to death with those same shields. Her body was thrown off the cliff, and her name was inscribed in stone, not as an honor, but as a legendary warning. From then on, Tarpeian Rock became a platform without speeches. No hanging, no crucifixion, just a push and an irreversible fall. A punishment both simple and perfect, bloodless, unobtrusive, untimely, but unforgettable. The irony, the rock was right next to the temple of Jupiter, the Roman god. That is, the traitor is given a final, ironic look up to heaven before being cast out of the sight of the gods. Crowds often gather below, not to save him, but to watch. Death is swift, not because of the height, but because of the message. It's not you're dead. It's you've been cast out of Rome, physically, spiritually, historically. Tarpeian Rock never needed an inscription. Its silence was the final message. In Rome, if you betrayed what was sacred, you weren't executed, you were erased. So the next time someone tells you they've been cast out of the group, nod sympathetically, and be thankful that, at least, that group isn't on the Capitoline Hill next to a rock called Tarpeia waiting for the next betrayal. If Rome had a reality show, it wasn't on TV. It was in the sun, on the sand, amid roars and applause. There was no director, no script, just blood, and teeth, and death by beast. Welcome to damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beast. A punishment reserved for those whom Rome didn't just want to eliminate, but tear apart in spectacular fashion. These could be prisoners of war, rebels, criminals, or most poignantly, early Christians who refused to bow to the gods of the empire. Rome didn't like quiet death. It liked spectacle, and the arena was the stage. The condemned were often brought in not in chains, but in costumes. Yes, Rome dressed them up. One might be dressed as Orpheus, and then torn apart in the middle of a mythological recital. Another played Prometheus, only to have his intestines ripped out by birds in a gruesomely accurate reenactment. This was no execution. This was a reenactment of a tragedy with real blood and real claws. A literal life and death spectacle. And if you were hoping that the men thrown in would at least hold weapons or have a chance to defend themselves. No, this was no combat. This was a sentencing in the shape of a hungry lion. Even if the animals weren't in the mood that day, if they were tired, lazy, or bored, the Roman soldiers would use clubs, hot irons, or tricks to awaken their predatory instincts. Blood had to be spilled, and the crowd had to be entertained. The spectators didn't just watch. They ate, they drank, they cheered. They probably munched on roasted chestnuts while a man was bitten by a leopard. They might have sipped wine as a Christian child was thrown before the beasts. Here, death was a side dish, and the screams were the soundtrack. The beasts were not chosen by chance. The lion, royal power. The leopard, swift, ruthless. The bear, wild. The elephant, heavy as judgment. Sometimes the victims died not in pain, but in symbol. They were swallowed by images, not just claws. For those who watched, it was a warning, a reminder in flesh. Rome is watching, and if you stray from the line, it will not be swords, but teeth. No rhetoric is more effective than watching a man dissolve into the mouth of a beast. Of course, later martyrs turned that death into glory, turned the arena into legend. But for most, damnatio ad bestias was not about faith. It was about blood, and fear, and screams lost to cheers. So the next time you have to attend a civil trial or complain about jury duty, remember, at least you don't have to dress up as a mythical creature, walk out to cheers, and run around in the sand while a lion thinks you're lunch. Not all Roman deaths were carried out on the sand, amid the roars of lions and the cheers of crowds. Not all punishments were bloody, fiery, or filled with screams. Some deaths were quieter, more neat, more ceremonial, and strangely more pleasant if you were a man of rank and played by the rules. Welcome to honorable suicide, death encouraged by the state with a polite invitation. The way it worked was simple, almost elegant. If you were a Roman senator, general, or patrician, someone who had ever sat at the emperor's right hand, and you accidentally stepped on an invisible line at the heart of the empire, Rome did not drag you into the middle of the forum. It did not tie you up. It did not throw you to the animals. Instead, you were given a scroll. A messenger knocks on your door, bows gently, and hands you a letter that probably begins, "For your honor, and to preserve the dignity of your family, Rome invites you to choose to end." There is no hanging sentence, no trial, only suggestions, and consequences if you refuse. Because if you don't accept the invitation, if you are too stubborn or too optimistic, Rome will deal with you. But no honor, no property, and certainly no words left. If you accept, everything is arranged. You have time to prepare, take a warm bath, write a last message, embrace your family one last time, sometimes under the silent gaze of a guard. Then you choose the razor, the poison chalice, or the bath. No one presses, but no one forgets to count the hours. One of the most famous deaths was that of the philosopher Seneca the Younger, accused of conspiring against the Emperor Nero. Maybe he was innocent, maybe he wasn't, but when the scroll reached him, he made no move. He slit his wrists. When the bleeding slowed, he cut his ankles. When that wasn't enough, he took poison. And finally, he stepped into a hot bath to speed up the process. It wasn't suicide, it was an essay on disappearance, written with the body. Sounds glorious? Maybe, but make no mistake, it wasn't a choice. It was the illusion of a choice. Rome didn't kill you, they invited you to disappear. And if you did it right, your family kept their fortune, your name wasn't erased from history, and maybe, just maybe, you would be remembered not for your death, but for how you died. Honorable suicide isn't a moment of courage. It's a contract. A deal between someone who once sat at the pinnacle of power and the system that had raised them up, and was now gently pushing them down. No blood, no crowds, just warm water, thin knives, and organized silence. So the next time you feel pressured to quit, or get an email with the subject line, "We appreciate your contributions." Remember, at least there's no one standing behind the door with a roll of paper and a small knife wrapped in silk. When you think of ancient torture, you usually picture swords, furnaces, or at least fire and ropes. But Rome, as always, went further. They didn't just want you to hurt. They wanted you to remember, to be humiliated, and, if you survived, to carry that fear with every step, every sit, for the rest of your life. And that's where the wooden donkey comes into play. A device with a funny-sounding name, almost harmless. But don't let the naivety of the word fool you. Because the donkey here isn't carrying anyone. It's carrying you straight to hell, through your pelvis. Picture a block of wood standing upright, turned into an upside-down letter A. The top is sharpened, thin as the back of a knife but not sharp enough to cut straight through. It's precisely designed not to kill you outright, but to slowly crush the flesh in the most vulnerable part of your body. Now imagine a man being dragged before the crowd, stripped of his lower body, hoisted high, and then lowered by the guard's hands. A slow, steady sitting, without words. His body weight does the rest. But don't worry if you're light or trying to stand on your feet. Rome has that covered. They'll hang stones from your ankles, making sure you sit down properly. For the first few minutes, the pain is vague. It's a sharp, piercing, indescribable sensation. But then the skin tears, the muscles tear, the blood vessels burst, and the pain goes from uncomfortable to unable to breathe. The condemned will moan, will scream, or bite their tongues to escape. Some, the lucky ones, will faint. Others will live long enough to feel every inch of their body split in two, not by swords, but by lifeless wood. But the scariest thing of all, they don't die, at least not immediately. The wooden donkey is not an instrument of execution. It is a warning, a visual lesson for others to stand around, hold their breath, and remember that Rome can tear your soul out with nothing but wood and gravity. After a few hours, if the guards decide they have had enough, they take you off. Not to spare you, but to throw you to the ground like a living corpse. You cannot stand. You cannot walk. And certainly you cannot sit down. Forever. And if Rome wants to go all the way, if you are a symbol of rebellion, a person to be made an example of, then you are left on the donkey. Overnight, over day, until your flesh is no longer a barrier, only bones and silence. No sentence, no condemnation, just you and a wooden triangle erected in the middle of the square. The cruelty here is not in the technique. It is in the calculation. No knife, no fire, no complexity. Just bring your own instrument of destruction, your own body weight. That's how Rome was. They didn't need to speak loudly. They whispered through instruments of torture. And when they needed someone to sit back and think, they didn't need a prison. They just needed a donkey that didn't know how to walk, but knew how to make others never walk again. So the next time you find your office chair a little hard, or complain about sitting in a meeting for too long, remember that you still have a cushion, a backrest, and most importantly, no one is tying rocks to your feet. The wooden donkey was not just a punishment. It was a stage. A silent stage where the audience did not applaud, only held its breath. Where the man suspended between honor and flesh became a living sign hanging in the square. This is what happens when you step out of line. And strangely enough, this punishment does not appear in the epic. No one erects a statue to honor the man who sat on the donkey. No one writes it down in sacred prose, because it is not for memory. It is for conditioned oblivion. Rome does not need you to die a glorious death. Rome needs you to become a whisper, to be heard by others as they pass by. Someone asked, why not just kill? Why torture with a spiked chair? Because death is the end, and the shame is long-lasting. Because Rome is not just a physical empire. It is a psychological empire. The pain is not in the blood. It is being dragged out into the midday sun, in front of your family, in front of your neighbors, in front of those who once bowed before you, and forced to sit down on an instrument that everyone knows. Sit once, never again. There are those who survive, come back, crawling through the streets with uneven steps, eyes cast down and whispers following their backs. They are called those who Saturday. They don't need prison clothes. They don't need names engraved on them. Just a crooked gate and a silence that lasts a lifetime. In Rome, not everyone who commits a crime deserves to be killed. Some people are chosen by Rome to be living warnings. And the wooden donkey is the perfect instrument for that. Not destroying, just transforming. Not erasing, just distorting. Don't think it's just a man's business. Women were also executed with the donkey, depending on the severity of their mistake. Rome could lengthen or shorten the execution. But the message is always the same. You are not the individual. You are the example. That was the real power of Rome. Not in the medals or the victories, but in the ability to make people self-regulate their behavior through the fear of sitting in the wrong place. And if you think those forms have disappeared, no, they have just changed their name. They have changed their form. Instead of the wooden donkey's back, we have the dismissal chair, the interview table, the resignation for personal reasons speech. There are places where you walk in with your head up and walk out with your head down. Rome is still alive. Behind the form, behind the rules, behind the seemingly normal chairs, we are still sitting. But not everyone is sitting still. After all that, after the screams, after the blows, after the smell of burning flesh, after the sound of bones breaking like dry twigs, there was silence. Not a sacred or serene silence. Not the silence of a temple or a Zen garden. It was the kind of silence typical of a city accustomed to punishment. A mute, callous silence. No one spoke because there was nothing left to say. No one asked because everyone understood. What had to be learned had already been taught in blood and iron in front of everyone. Rome, when it had finished a man, no longer needed to keep the body to show anyone. Cleaned up, sometimes surprisingly quickly. No tombstones, no obvious traces. Just a little more gray than usual on the ground. A scorched pillar. A faint scratch on the steps. A few pieces of skin or hair stuck between the bricks. And then people passed by again. They walked a little faster, a little less looking. It might not be mentioned at dinner, not out of fear, but because it didn't need to be told. Everyone had seen it, and Rome knew visual memory lingers longer than words. A properly executed execution lives on, not on paper, not in history books, but in deeds, in looks, in silence. A father holding his son's hand walks past the old execution post, not explaining. The child doesn't ask. He has seen, already knows that there are questions not asked aloud. The wisdom of the ruled is not to understand. It's to know when to pretend not to see. Rome doesn't need more killing. It just needs those who saw that death to live. To live long enough to pass that unspoken fear on to the next generation. Not by lesson, but by air. By turning away at the right moment. By quietly leaving when the story begins to touch on things that shouldn't be told. It was a kind of silence that no one taught you, but that you learned quickly. Because Rome designed it that way. After each punishment, life returned. A shop opened. A widow swept the yard. A group of children played with an old brick. No one seemed sad. No one seemed excited. The execution was no longer an event. It was the background, part of the scene, like the paving stones, like the sound of a cart, like the dust in the air. And Rome, more than any other civilization, understood that if you repeat something long enough, it becomes normal. Even if it is a human being smashed to pieces in the marketplace. The silence did not come from compassion. Came from efficiency. A society without guards is a society where the people guard themselves. An ideal order where fear is implanted into the rhythm of life. No one checks you, but you behave. No soldiers at the door, but you keep your mouth shut. That is the ultimate triumph of punishment, when it no longer needs to be present, but still controls everything. You still go to work. You still shop. You still have dinner with your family. But you have changed because you have seen it, because you do not want it to happen again to yourself, to your children, to anyone else who might drag you into that cycle. And so you shut up, control yourself, regulate yourself, limit yourself before anyone else has to. Rome, in that moment, no longer needs force. They have your memory, and that is enough. Not everyone who offends authority is killed. Some Rome wants to keep as living proof. No longer human, only illustrations. In the imperial penal system, cutting off the tongue was reserved for a special kind of crime. Saying something that should not be said. Not theft, not murder, not rebellion with weapons, but words. A blasphemous remark. A satire on the emperor. A secret song mocking the court. A whisper in the night heard by a servant. Rome did not tolerate words. Not because they were immediately dangerous, but because they lived. Words could get into someone's head, grow, multiply. And then one day a crowd, a city rebelled. A city fell. So instead of killing, Rome chose to cut. Not to extinguish life, just the ability to speak. The execution did not require a grand stage or flags. Just a wooden chair, a few guards, a red-hot brazier, and a pair of pliers. The condemned man was tied, not to a post, but to the chair he sat on. His head was secured with a leather strap, tied behind the chair. His jaw was pried open with a wooden stick or an iron hook. If he resisted, 2 guards held his knees and shoulders. Some people understood, they did not resist. They knew nothing could save them anymore. When the mouth was open, the executioner approached. No words, no questions. The left hand held the lower jaw. The right hand held the pliers, usually flat, thick, lightly heated to prevent slipping. The pliers slid in, grabbing the base of the tongue. A sharp jerk. The sound was not the tongue. It was the sound of flesh breaking, the jawbone snapping, and blood gushing out of the throat. The person being executed often tried to scream, but no one heard. There was only the whistling of the wind, the boiling of the blood, and the choking sound. A last, useless reflex. If they are conscious, the next step is hot iron. A red-hot iron is inserted into the mouth, not to weld, but to burn. Clean of disease, clean of the possibility of reconnection, clean of the idea of rebellion. The smell of burning flesh in another person's mouth is something not easily forgotten. It is not like roasting meat. It is moister, more burnt, more human. And then the person is pulled up. Not dead. No more screaming. No more words. Only open eyes, torn mouth, trembling neck. What was once language is now blood and emptiness. But that is not all. These people are often not locked up. They are released, not out of pity, but because their existence is a commandment that does not need to be written. They are seen walking in the streets, wearing scarves around their mouths, constantly gesturing with their hands, but no one understands. They try to speak, but every sentence becomes a hiss, a gagging, and finally silence. Silence is not by choice, but by force. Society learns very quickly. No one needs a "do not speak falsely" plaque. No one needs a blasphemy tablet. Just a mute man with a scar burned on his chin. That's enough. Children look. Adults bow. Shopkeepers look away. And Rome, far away, need not be present. Not all capital punishments ended in a quick death. Some were designed not to be finished, but to be displayed. Rome didn't just want to kill, it wanted people to watch death, learn from it, and remember it in the flesh. Breaking the wheel was one such execution. There was no masked executioner, no quick beheading, no simple ending, just the wheel, the iron rod, and time. The victim was tied to a large wooden wheel, the kind used for chariots, but taken apart and laid out horizontally. The arms and legs were stretched out, tied to the spokes. Sometimes they were hung upside down from a post, sometimes laid out horizontally in the middle of the courtyard. The position didn't matter. The exposure was important. The executioner took his time. He held a heavy iron rod in his hand, moving from the highest part of the body to the lowest. A blow to the arm broken, not much blood but a loud crack. A blow to the leg, broken knee, foot turned backwards. In order: ribs, wrists, pelvis. Not in biological order, but in the art of pain. The victims do not die immediately. That is the rule. Sometimes they lose consciousness, then they are doused with water to revive them. Sometimes they beg for death, then they are silenced. The body begins to twist around the wheel like an asymmetrical sculpture. Arms folded to the chest, legs twisted back, neck tilted to one side, eyes still open. When all the bones are broken, there is no escape, no running, no hiding. The wheel is erected, attached to a pole pulled up high, on a hill outside the city at a crossroads. Wherever there are many people, that is the place chosen. From a distance, it looks like a sculpture of human bones. No paint, no wooden frame. The body itself, the deformation of the human form, is the main language. Arms and legs stretched out indefinitely, neck tilted, chest sunken. A pose that no one can imitate, because to achieve it, one must die first. Sometimes people were exposed for 3 days before dying. Some lived to the 5th day. Their faces were swollen, flies swarmed, flesh shriveled, bones exposed in places. People passed by, no one dared to point. They walked slowly, eyes downcast. But everyone remembered. Rome called it a demonstration. Others called it art. But everyone understood. This was a lesson not for reason. It hit the bone and left a mark no one wanted to test. No tombstone, no name, just a wheel and a person twisted like a forced memory. Rome did not need to shout, "This is power." They erected it and let everyone see. In the list of deaths designed to impress, there is one method that goes against all of that. No blood, no screaming, no slashing. Just dust. But not ordinary dust. Hot dust. Ashes burned until red, then ground into a fine powder, and turned into an instrument of murder that leaves no marks. The condemned were not hanged, not beheaded, not crucified. They were buried alive up to the neck. The earth was packed tightly around the shoulders, preventing movement. The hands were tied behind the back, or buried with them. Only the face was above the ground, the mouth, or rather, because that was where the execution would begin. A funnel was forced into the mouth. The mouth had to be completely open, usually by an iron rod or a soldier's hand, held in place by a rope. The person could not scream. The jaw was pried open, the throat forced open. Then hot ash was poured slowly down the funnel. Not cold ash. Ashes from wood, coal, sometimes other human remains, red hot, cooled enough to not burn the funnel, but still holding a deadly heat. When the ash falls into the throat, it burns from within. Unlike the fire outside, hot ash cuts into the throat, burns numbly, and blocks the windpipe. The person being executed coughs, hiccups, vomits, but nothing comes out. Only ash continues to fall, covering the larynx, filling the lungs. No blood, no knife, no scream, only a trembling face, eyes wide open, neck twitching and then frozen. A dry, silent death, as if the person were being evaporated by air and dust. When the ash fills the mouth, the throat is badly burned, suffocated, and dies slowly in minutes, sometimes 10. The eyes stop moving before the heart stops, for fear surpasses pain. No one cries, no one screams. The scene is almost silent. Even the wind cannot blow through the thick ash. When it was all over, the funnel was pulled out. The head was still there, mouth open, ash pouring out from the sides. No slash marks, no dismemberment, just dust and absolute silence. The ash was then covered over the entire body. No removal, no burial, no marker left. The man became dust, truly, as if he had never existed. Rome did not just kill, they erased. Not with hammers, but with ash. No face left, just a silent suffocation in the memory of the witness. Death does not always come with a sword. There are sentences that do not strike the flesh, but aim at existence. Do not hurt the body, but empty the memory. Rome knew that a man could be killed many times. First the body, then the name. Damnatio memoriae, a sentence not for the body but for the memory. No execution, no blood, just total obliteration. From tombstones, statues, even the collective memory. The condemned would literally disappear. No words would mention them. No carvings on walls. No portraits on mosaics. Stone statues would have their faces chiseled away. Texts would have their names erased. Chronicles would be rewritten as if they had never existed. Even those who knew them had to learn to pretend to forget, because if anyone mentioned them again, it meant the crime had not been burned to the core. One of the most obvious examples is the name of Geta, the younger brother of the Emperor Caracalla. They ruled together, stood together in twin statues, were both engraved in history books. Then, overnight, they were killed by their own brother. And after his death, Geta was not buried. He was erased. The twin statues were split. One side remained, the other was carved blank. The text with his name was scratched out letter by letter. Even on the walls of the palace, people scratched away his carvings by hand, leaving strange indentations where a person had once been. It was a bloodless punishment, but it left a deeper fear than the sword. Because when no one remembers you, you are not just dead, you have never lived. Rome did not need executioners to punish. They had stonemasons, secretaries, historians, and silence, a civilization that can rewrite history like a report, and the erased cannot resist, cannot be present, cannot return. No one hangs you, they just take away the reason you ever existed. In that empire, history is the weapon, and memory is the battlefield. Rome was not just an empire of roads, bridges, and laws. Rome was an empire of punishment. Their death was not simply an end, it was a message. Each person executed was not simply a criminal, but a punctuation mark in the declaration of power. Some were crucified so that their blood would drip into the ground. Some were burned in fire, others were ground to pieces on wheels, their throats filled with ash until they could no longer breathe. Some names were chiseled from statues, erased from history books, vanished from memory as if they had never existed. Rome did not need to kill everyone. It only needed to kill a few in a sufficiently gruesome way, and let the rest be silenced. Not by fear of death, but by the knowledge that there would be nothing left after. No excuses, no cries, no tombstones, not even a name to be mentioned. The greatest punishment was not the destruction of the body, but the suffocation of the memory until it was forgotten. The empire did not rule by reason. It ruled by example. A punishment clear enough, a permanent warning. A body bent on the wheel not to frighten, but to turn bones into sculpture. A tongue cut out not to bleed, but to prove that not everyone has the right to speak. A man poured ashes down his neck not to suffer, but to die in silence. And when memory is also executed, there is no turning back for Rome's enemies. Not through blood, not through tears, not through history. In the end, Rome did not win because of its armies, or its laws, or its stone streets. It won because it knew how to make silence its most terrifying legacy. It left not stories, but empty spaces. Nothing reminds like a blank space erased by the touch of a hand. No one speaks like one who has been silenced forever. And when the last name is chiseled from the stone wall, what remains is not Rome. It is absence organized into a system. An empire does not exist to remember, but to select who is allowed to live in memory. Who remains, who is lost, is not injustice. It is in stone. Before he became the world's most legendary barrel-dwelling philosopher, Diogenes was simply the son of a banker in the Greek city of Sinope. Yes, the man who would later scoff at gold and spit on true wealth was born from money. And that didn't last long. Diogenes' life changed when he and his father Hesius were implicated in a rather creative crime, debasing the local currency. Not in a figurative sense, they were accused of actually tampering with the coins, perhaps thinning them or counterfeiting them. Whether Diogenes knew exactly what he was doing or was just helping his father run the family business is still up for debate. But it was clear that the local authorities were not amused, and so the would-be cynic was promptly banished. Now, for most people, being banished from their homeland would be a tragedy. For Diogenes, it was a career move. He fled to Athens, the philosophical center of the Greek world, and decided that rather than crawl back into respectable society, he would destroy it bit by bit with his sarcasm, sharp tongue, and complete disregard for pants. Athens at that time was full of prestigious thinkers and skilled sophists. Plato, Aristotle, the whole gang. Diogenes, penniless and technically homeless, didn't care. While the others debated metaphysics in his linen robes, He rolled into town with a dog-like grin and a mission: to expose every falsehood he could sniff out. And yes, dog is not a metaphor. He accepted it. In fact, he proudly identified himself with the word kynikos, which means dog in Greek, which is where we get the word cynic. Barking at corruption, biting at convention, licking at the raw, unfiltered truth. His first task, to throw away all social pretenses. He renounced wealth, scoffed at politeness, and slept in a giant ceramic jar, often mistakenly called a barrel, like a philosophical raccoon. That was his final statement. If society was a facade, he lived outside it. Literally, this was not just rebellion for rebellion's sake. Diogenes believed that virtue came from living in harmony with nature. And nature did not need money, fame, or a 10-room mansion. It only needed honesty and maybe a sturdy vessel. If Athens was the heart of philosophical prestige, Plato was its golden child. Polished, venerable, and entirely too serious for Diogenes' taste. While Plato classified virtues and defined abstract ideals, Diogenes peed on them literally and figuratively. One of the most famous anecdotes involves Plato attempting to define man as a hairless biped. He thought it was a clever summary of our species. Diogenes, ever ready to mock, plucked a chicken and brought it into the academy, loudly proclaiming, "Behold Plato's man." The joke was so impressive that Plato was forced to revise the definition by adding wide flat nails. Score 1 for the man in the jar. But Diogenes wasn't just trolling for attention. He believed that philosophers like Plato had become so absorbed in abstract nonsense that they had forgotten to live with integrity. For Diogenes, virtue was not something to be argued about. It was something to be lived. And if that meant heckling the intellectual elite while munching onions and looking homeless, so be it. He had a habit of disrupting Plato's lectures, passing through crowds with a lantern in broad daylight, muttering that he was looking for an honest man. The crowd laughed nervously because deep down they knew he was right. Athens, with all its democratic ideals and marble buildings, had become a place of polite lies and philosophical demonstrations. Diogenes ripped it apart with his blunt honesty. Plato is said to have called Diogenes Socrates gone mad. And that was not entirely wrong. Like Socrates, Diogenes asked uncomfortable questions and refused to play by the rules of society. But unlike Socrates, Diogenes did not want dialogue. He wanted spectacle. And he was happy to play the clown if it meant exposing hypocrisy. He made simple life seem absurd. He begged without shame. He ate whatever he could find, defecated wherever he pleased, often to the horror of onlookers. But every action, no matter how crude, is a philosophical statement. Why should he feel ashamed of his natural functions when others feel no shame in lying, cheating, and hoarding wealth? While Plato built an ideal world, Diogenes shattered the illusion of this world. And if you ask him, that makes him a true philosopher. Even if he smells like old olives and is terrified of the world. By this time, Diogenes has become a full-time philosophical menace, with no fixed address, unless you count the large ceramic pot he sleeps in, hidden in the market like some kind of sentient street art. He owns almost nothing, just a cloak, a stick, and a cup, until he sees a boy drinking from his hand and promptly throws the cup away. A kid beat me to the punch on simplicity in life. He said that's what Diogenes was about. He didn't just talk about simplicity. He simplified people. He didn't pretend to deny wealth while secretly hoarding silver under his mattress. No, he actually lived on leftovers, bathed in rainwater, and slept with dogs. In fact, he often called himself a dog, not out of self-abasement, but out of honor. Dogs live naturally, without shame, pretense, or obsession with status. And that is exactly how Diogenes wanted to live, including the barking. Then there was the lamp or lantern, depending on the translation, that he was famous for carrying around during the day. What are you doing? People will ask. He will grumble that he is looking for an honest man. Of course, the implication is clear. He cannot find one. He does not even hope to. The joke is the point. A slap in the face to all those who consider themselves virtuous while living a life filled with compromise. His daily life becomes performance art, and every gesture a lesson. When caught masturbating in public, he is said to have joked, If only rubbing your belly were that easy to relieve hunger. Rude, absolutely. But for Diogenes, the act of nature was not shameful. Hypocrisy was. And let's be clear, Diogenes was not poor because he had to be. He was provided with shelter, food, even patronage by wealthy admirers. He rejected them like someone dodging a pyramid scheme. To him, accepting charity meant binding himself to an obligation, and Diogenes would not be bound. Not by money, not by politeness, and certainly not by the embarrassed coughs of society when he did something uncivilized in public. He did not live on the fringes of society. He had buried himself there like a thorn, sharp and unpleasant and impossible to ignore. While everyone else was busy polishing their masks, Diogenes proudly flaunted his filth. And in a world filled with roles and rituals, it was a radical act. One of the most iconic encounters in ancient philosophy, and perhaps all of history, occurred between the dirtiest man in Athens and the most powerful man on earth. Alexander the Great appeared, a young conqueror with the ego of a god and an army to back him up. After hearing stories of Diogenes, Alexander was intrigued. Here was a man who had nothing, wanted nothing, feared nothing, and yet commanded attention throughout the Greek world. Naturally, Alexander had to meet him. He found Diogenes lounging in his jar, sunning himself like a stray cat who happened to be well versed in moral philosophy. The king of Macedon approached and asked the famous question, "Can I help you?" And Diogenes, without even sitting up, replied, "Yes, stay out of my sunlight." Meek drop. Alexander's entourage was horrified. This man had just dismissed the ruler of most of the known world as a pedantic peddler. But Alexander, he was impressed. According to legend, he turned to his soldiers and said, "If I were not Alexander, I would like to be Diogenes." It's the kind of statement history professors love to quote and YouTube comment sections love to misspell. But regardless of historical accuracy, the moment captures the essence of Dionysius. In a world obsessed with power, he was untouchable because he wanted nothing. He had no palace, no army, no reputation to protect. You can't bribe a man who sleeps in a jar. You can't blackmail a beggar. And you certainly can't impress a man who finds luxury ridiculous. What Diogenes taught Alexander and the world was that true power comes from needing nothing and fearing no one. That was Diogenes' ultimate rebellion. Not shouting in the streets, not peeing on social conventions, but stripping life down to its essentials and defying anyone who called him poor. In a single sentence, he turned one of history's greatest conquerors into a shadow that eclipsed the sun. And unlike most philosophers, Diogenes didn't just preach about this freedom. He lived so fully that even emperors felt small in his presence. Now imagine trying to impress your friends afterward. Good luck. By now, Diogenes was more than just a local eccentric. He was the embodiment of a new way of thinking, skepticism, not the watered-down version we use today when someone is squeamish about politics. No, the original skepticism was wild, primitive, and had fleas. Diogenes believed that society had become corrupt because it was built on lies. Lies about happiness, virtue, success. People spend their lives chasing wealth, climbing the social ladder, and filling their heads with abstract nonsense. Diogenes looked at all that and said, "No thanks. I'd rather sleep in a pot and eat leftovers." At its core, cynicism is about living in harmony with nature. It means giving up all artificial needs, luxuries, fame, political ambitions, and returning to a life of simplicity and self-sufficiency. If nature doesn't give you a golden cup, you probably don't need one. And if nature gives you a stomach, then yes, begging for bread or stealing an onion is more honest than flattering a politician. His philosophy was also deeply confrontational. Diogenes didn't hide his beliefs in treatises or temple scrolls. He lived them out loud. He mocked, barked at, and even interrupted people's lives to force them to see their own contradictions. If someone preached virtue but lived lavishly, Diogenes would go after them like a philosophical booger, exposing the corruption beneath the silk. For Diogenes, actions were far more important than ideas. In fact, he once said, "Other dogs bite their enemies. I bite my friends to save them." Because nothing says friendship like a good metaphorical gnawing at the ankles of your illusions. He was especially brutal about pretense, especially among philosophers. If a scholar claimed that poverty was noble while living in comfort, Diogenes would hold up a mirror, metaphorically or otherwise. He once witnessed a lavish temple being built and declared, "The gods must be blind if they needed such a grand house." In a world obsessed with images, Diogenes was the natural predator of images. While others hid their ambitions with flowery words, he laid it all bare, literally and figuratively. He wasn't trying to be liked. He was trying to awaken people. And if that means barking like a dog or relieving himself on public statues, then so be it. The truth, after all, isn't always polite. Diogenes wasn't just a philosopher. He was the walking conscience of Athens. A dirty, noisy, deeply inconvenient conscience. Depending on who you ask, he was either a madman with bowel control problems or the only sane man in a city full of liars. Maybe both. He made a career out of offending people. Once at a banquet, he walked barefoot across the banquet hall's expensive carpet, wiped the mud off his feet, and muttered, "So I have trampled on Plato's pride." Not exactly RSVP, but for Diogenes this was more than just rudeness. It was a protest against vanity, excess, and all the empty formalities people surround themselves with to feel important. He challenged people. When he saw a rich man giving to the poor just to be admired, Diogenes muttered, "That's not charity, that's investing." Another time, he saw a man angry at being slapped and said, "You shouldn't be angry, that's just meat hitting meat." This is not just philosophy, it's psychological judo. But Diogenes' real genius wasn't just what he said. It was how he lived. His daily life was a critique of everything people took for granted. He turned the world upside down and held it there, waiting to see what coins would fall. Of course, not everyone appreciated the free lessons. He was ridiculed, attacked, and even arrested. Although trying to capture a man without property and without shame is like trying to confiscate smoke. In a city after being captured and sold into slavery, yes, really, he calmly said to the auctioneer, "Sell me to a man who needs a master." Let that sink in. He eventually met a Corinthian man named Xeniades, who not only bought Diogenes. He took him into his home and let him run the household, educate the children, and essentially become a satirical life coach. Somehow, Diogenes turned slavery into a series of lectures. Whether he was insulting kings or instructing children, Diogenes was painfully consistent. He mocked every power structure, even the ones he had unwittingly become a part of. If anyone tried to praise him too much, he would remind them that he was just a dog chasing truth and occasionally pissing on golden statues. He was a permanent part of society. The more you tried to ignore him, the more he would sink into your conscience. To say that Diogenes had strong views on social conventions is like saying that the sun is a little warm. He didn't just reject polite customs. He waged a one-man war against them with the ferocity of a barefoot prophet and the cleanliness of a disobedient raccoon. Bathing was an overrated dining ritual. Shame was a useless tool used by cowards and hypocrites to hide behind marble columns. Diogenes believed that most social norms were not there to help people. They existed to control them, to shame them, and to separate the powerful from the poor. So naturally, he decided to live in a way that defied all of that. He often walked barefoot through the dilapidated streets, even in winter. When asked why he didn't wear shoes like a normal person, he replied, "If I needed shoes, I would be more miserable about my life than about my feet." Diogenes also had a knack for performing embarrassing bodily functions in public, not out of ignorance. He knew exactly what he was doing. These actions were not random. They were statements. He believed that if something was natural and necessary, it should not be a source of shame. In other words, if you are going to scold me for burping, but not for cheating on your neighbor, then your moral compass is broken. Even begging became a form of protest. While most beggars tried to appeal to pity or social obligation, Diogenes saw it as a spiritual challenge for himself and the person being begged. If they gave, great. If they didn't, that was fine too. Either way, he was honest and hungry. But Diogenes wasn't just rebelling for the sake of rebelling. His whole existence was a constant experiment to see how little one needed to live well, not just survive, to live well, with dignity, with freedom, with a sense of humor sharp enough to cut through the pomp of politicians and the polished language of philosophers. He exposed the absurdity of conventions by completely ignoring them. And the more people insisted that he was acting normally, the harder he tried, proving that many of the behaviors we call civilized are really just rituals we perform to make ourselves feel superior. In a world obsessed with masks, Diogenes, barefaced and perhaps barefoot, smiled into the sunlight, asking us why we didn't do the same. Of course, Diogenes left no memoirs, marble busts, or temples in his honor. He wouldn't want them. In fact, if someone tried to build him a statue, he would probably spit on it. His legacy lies not in what he created, but in what he destroyed. The illusions, the pretense, the ego. His death, like everything else about Diogenes, is surrounded by stories that range from the tragic, the ridiculous, and the utterly fitting. Some say he died holding his breath, fed up with life. Others say he died from a dog bite. The irony is obvious to anyone familiar with his nickname. And then there's the version where he just lay down, said nothing, and didn't get up. No final words, no dramatic curtain call, just the world's loudest cynic quietly slipping away, as if even death didn't impress him. When asked how he wanted to be buried, Diogenes is said to have replied, "Throw me outside the city walls and let wild beasts tear me apart." Shocked, someone asked if he was worried about animals tearing him apart. Diogenes replied, "Not if you give me a stick to drive them away." "But you won't be able to use it," the man pointed out. "So why should I care what happens to me when I die?" Diogenes 1, Death 0. In the centuries after his death, Dionysius's teachings did not die out. They spread like wildfire among those tired of pretense. His skeptical style inspired an entire school of thought, influencing later Stoics like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, who borrowed the ideas of self-sufficiency and virtue untainted by wealth or fame. Even today, in an age obsessed with filters, followers, and fortune, Diogenes feels strangely relevant. He's a reminder that true freedom doesn't come from owning more, it comes from needing less. That dignity doesn't come from titles, but from living up to your values, even if those values include shouting at statues and living in a crate. He may have died penniless, homeless, and barefoot, but Diogenes left behind something far more durable than gold. Uncomfortable truth. The kind of truth that sticks in your brain like a splinter and dares you to laugh at yourself. Or at least wonder why you didn't bring a lantern. You'd think a man who barked at people, slept in a jar, and publicly berated Plato would be a forgotten footnote in philosophy. Yet Diogenes has become a symbol not of madness, but of radical honesty in a world built on illusion. The fact that we still talk about him after more than 2,000 years says something. It says that deep down, people still yearn for the truth, even if it smells like onions and lives in a barrel. Diogenes is important today because his life was a provocation. He dared to ask, what happens when you stop playing along? What happens when you stop chasing wealth, fame, even comfort, and just live with what you need? Strip away all the show, the polite lies, the curated identities. What remains? According to Diogenes, what remains is true freedom. In a society built on image, ancient Athens, or Instagram, his rejection of appearance is worse than ever. He didn't just question authority or wealth. He questioned the need for them. That's why so many thinkers, from Stoics to anarchists to comedians, have taken inspiration from him. He was the first minimalist, the spiritual father of all the "I quit my six-figure job to live in a van" stories you see online. Even Diogenes' rudeness has a place. He used shock not to offend but to expose. He wanted people to feel uncomfortable because that is where reflection begins. If you feel more uncomfortable when someone defecates in public than you do when you are corrupt in government or greed in religion, Diogenes would say your priorities are reversed. And while his methods are unconventional, the core message is timeless. Virtue is not something you buy, label, or broadcast. It is how you live when no one is looking, or in Diogenes' case, when everyone is actually looking and you don't care. He reminds us that wisdom doesn't always wear a cloak. Sometimes it screams out of a jar, laughs in your face, and refuses to move away from the sunlight. In a world filled with noise, branding, and nonsense, Diogenes invites us to be different, honest, unfiltered, and just a little bit dog-like. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes him the wisest madman who ever lived. On the Giza Plateau, where the sun scorches the desert and the shadows of pyramids stretch long across the sand, every gaze is drawn upward. Tourists arrive from all over the world to look up at greatness. The towering pyramids, monuments to human will and mystery, and the great Sphinx, half lion, half man, guarding the necropolis with silent authority, forever facing the rising sun. Giza is a place of grandeur exposed, of marvels reaching toward the sky. But few ever ask the question, what lies beneath? Beneath the burning sand, beneath the Nile, whose waters have shifted course like the breathing of the ages, beneath the ancient layers of mud and silt that time itself seems to have forgotten. There, only a short distance from Giza, lies the quiet village of Abu Rash, a place with no temples, no monuments, but with a legend whispered across generations. The villagers speak of a massive shape, half buried in the water, a back, curved, symmetrical, unmistakably feline in form, too precise to be natural, too deliberate to be coincidence. When the river withdraws during the dry season, strange curved stones and faint carved lines appear, only briefly, before disappearing once more into the silence. There are no signs, no walking trails, no velvet ropes or tourist buses idling nearby, only reeds, stagnant water, and a quiet that seems to hum with something ancient. The place does not announce itself. It waits, as if it's guarding a secret, not by hiding it, but by letting it remain unspoken. And then, inevitably, the question rises. What is buried beneath Egypt's holy ground? What story has not yet been unearthed? If there is a second Sphinx, one submerged, forgotten, and perhaps even older, then everything we think we know about ancient Egypt may be incomplete. Maybe Giza is not the beginning of the story. Maybe it is the echo, a monument built atop a memory that still breathes beneath the mud. While the world's eyes remain fixed on the towering marvels above the sand, a quiet ripple has stirred beneath the surface, among reeds, beneath brackish water, and within the minds of those unwilling to accept that history has already been fully written. In the shadow of Giza, near the village of Abu Rash, a series of strange findings has emerged. Not from myths alone, but from instruments, sensors, and curious eyes brave enough to ask, what lies beneath? Modern explorers, operating far from tourist paths, have employed advanced tools in their search. Sonar scanners pierce the murky waters, and ground-penetrating radar, GPR, probes the sediment. High-resolution satellite imagery is layered atop, revealing not chaos, but clarity. What they've uncovered is deeply unsettling to conventional timelines. Geometric blocks with startling symmetry, lines too straight, contours too intentional. The radar returns don't resemble scattered boulders. They hint at structure, order, design. Some alignments even suggest astronomical orientation, as if whatever lies beneath was placed with purpose, with celestial awareness, not by accident but by ancient calculation. Yet this mystery didn't begin in laboratories or academic institutions. It began quietly in the 1980s when independent researchers, divers, amateurs, and uncredentialed Egypt enthusiasts began whispering about something strange near Abu Rash. They described what appeared to be the base of paws, lion-like, emerging from muck. Others mentioned a worn but discernible face, too weathered to be clear, yet too human-like to be ignored. There were carved lines that seemed far too smooth, far too deliberate to be the work of erosion alone. Their reports were filled with conviction, photographs blurred by sediment and time, but the response they received was near universal. Silence, ridicule, dismissal. Wishful thinking, they were told. Geological coincidence. Still, the place itself refuses to fade. It's not part of any official archaeological register. No plaques mark its presence. The area is an ecological dead zone, thick with reeds and stagnant water. Tour buses never pass through. No footpaths lead in. It's the exact opposite of Giza. Where one is flooded with spotlights, this site remains hidden in shadow. Only those willing to brave mosquito-choked wetlands and uneasy ground arrive, and when they do, many report the same sensation. This land feels alive, not with life but with memory. as if it's watching, waiting, refusing to be forgotten. From these fragments, lines in mud, sonar scans, blurred photographs, a theory begins to take form. What if this is not erosion, not coincidence? What if what lies buried here is intentional, a monument submerged, not destroyed, but hidden? The geometry is too clean, the symmetry too precise. These are not things water does by accident. Slowly, the question shifts from what is this to why has it been ignored? And in that silence, the possibility grows louder. Perhaps what lies beneath is not only ancient, but inconvenient. Perhaps it challenges the foundation upon which all other timelines have been built. For centuries, the academic world has anchored the age of Egypt's Great Sphinx at around 2500 BCE, crediting its construction to Pharaoh Khafre of the 4th dynasty. It's a comfortable placement, tidy, logical, and supported by surrounding tombs and inscriptions. But what if that timeline is not the beginning? What if the Sphinx that draws millions of eyes each year isn't the first of its kind, but a replica, an echo of something older, deeper, and now submerged beneath time, silt, and silence? The so-called underwater Sphinx, hidden near Abu Rash, may predate not just the pyramids, but the very formation of Egypt as a nation. If the features observed, symmetry, geometry, erosion patterns, are indeed artificial, then its origins must be traced back to a time when Egypt had no pharaohs, no tombs, and no hieroglyphs. It suggests construction in a pre-dynastic era, long before the first official kings carved their names into stone. We would be looking not at a monument of empire, but at a relic of a forgotten world. To understand its possible age, we must look to the ancient environment in which it might have been built. Between roughly 10,000 and 5,000 BCE, North Africa experienced what scientists now call the African Humid Period, the time of the Green Sahara. Back then, the vast desert we know today was a fertile savanna. Lakes dotted the landscape. Rainfall was abundant. Herds of animals roamed freely. And the Nile River, far from the narrow, docile ribbon we see today, was wild, braided into branches, prone to massive flooding, and entirely unstable. It was a world more alive, more fertile, more unpredictable. This period provided the perfect conditions for a prehistoric people to leave their mark in stone, only to have that mark buried beneath millennia of shifting terrain and seasonal floods. If the submerged structure near Abu Rash does indeed date to this time, it would belong to a lost chapter in human history, a chapter written not in ink, but in erosion. That erosion may be the key. Geologist Dr. Robert Schoch, among others, has long argued that the vertical fissures around the Great Sphinx of Giza are not the work of wind and sand, but of heavy, sustained rainfall. Rain Egypt hasn't seen since before 7000 BCE. The implication is staggering. If true, then the Giza Sphinx itself must be thousands of years older than traditionally believed. Now, apply that same logic to the underwater formation. The grooves seen in sonar and photographic surveys are rounded, vertical, and smoothed in ways inconsistent with modern Nile flooding. They resemble the same long-forgotten water signatures that Schoch pointed to, cut not by desert winds, but by a world where the skies opened often, and with force. The comparisons don't stop there. Consider Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, dated to 9600 BCE, a megalithic temple complex built by a pre-agricultural society, with carved stone pillars and celestial alignments. If such a site could exist so early, why not in Egypt? The underwater Sphinx may represent another node in a global pattern, a civilization or civilizations that thrived before history's curtain officially rose, a people who built in stone before they wrote in symbols, who aligned monuments to stars before they built cities. If this theory is correct, the implications are seismic. It would shake the very bedrock of what we think we know about Egypt and about civilization itself. Pharaohs would no longer stand as the first stone builders. Instead, they might be inheritors of an earlier tradition, one whose knowledge was passed down not through scrolls, but through whispers in the earth. The underwater Sphinx would not just be a relic, it would be a key, a door, a challenge to the boundaries of time, asking not just when we began, but what we forgot. Despite growing whispers and mounting curiosity, The so-called underwater sphinx near Abu Rash remains untouched. Not a single shovel has officially broken ground. No excavation sanctioned by the Egyptian government has ever been attempted at the site. The structure, if it exists, lives in the murky realm of unofficial reports, speculative sonar scans, and the testimonies of independent researchers. It has been circled, measured, theorized, but never formally acknowledged. And that silence in itself speaks volumes. Everything we know about the alleged structure comes not from state-sponsored institutions, but from the margins: divers, amateur geologists, rogue scholars, and unaffiliated researchers. Their work exists in academic exile, pushed to the fringes of legitimacy. Without approval, funding, or peer-reviewed support, their findings remain anecdotal, no matter how compelling. The mainstream academic world, for the most part, has chosen to look the other way. And the reasons are many. Egypt is one of the most tightly regulated archaeological environments in the world. To excavate any site, especially one that lies near sacred monuments and historical landmarks, requires layers of legal and bureaucratic approval. Permits must be obtained from the Supreme Council of Antiquities. Detailed excavation plans must be submitted, proving that the project will neither damage the site nor disrupt Egypt's carefully curated historical narrative. In many cases, international oversight is required. Committees of scholars must weigh in. Cultural and historical review boards must assess the impact. Then there is the matter of logistics. This is not a desert dig. It is an operation in marshland, under seasonal floodwaters. To even begin, an excavation would require high-capacity water extraction systems, underwater archaeological technology, and ecological protections for the surrounding area. The cost? Immense. The timeline? Likely measured in decades. And without definitive proof beforehand, without a guarantee that something extraordinary lies beneath, the risk becomes too great for many institutions. Most aren't willing to gamble millions on what might turn out to be weathered limestone. But perhaps the greatest barrier isn't political or logistical. It's academic. To dig up a structure that might be older than the Great Sphinx of Giza is to threaten the foundation of modern Egyptology. The mainstream timeline tells us that Egyptian civilization began around 3000 BCE with the rise of the First Dynasty. The Great Sphinx, carved during the reign of Khafre around 2500 BCE, fits neatly into that framework. But a monument older than that, one not attributed to pharaohs, one without hieroglyphs, would demand a rewriting of textbooks, a reassessment of what defines a civilization, and a rethinking of the role Egypt played in the ancient world. Some argue that this resistance isn't just about evidence, it's about control. A discovery of that magnitude could disrupt tourism, national pride, and institutional prestige. Egypt's history is not just history. It's a global brand. And brands require consistency. A timeline-shattering find beneath the Nile mud could create more questions than answers. Questions the authorities may not be ready or willing to face. So the silence continues. Strategic, careful, and perhaps intentional. What can't be disproven is simply ignored. What might change everything is left buried. For now, not because it is unimportant, but because it may be too important. ChatGPT to NOI. Situated on the northern edge of the Giza Plateau, the region of Abu Rash is not a name that echoes through tour guides or museum brochures. It is a place passed over, forgotten by maps and modern movement. And yet, beneath its silence, it may hold the most important unanswered question in Egyptology. This area sits within a low-lying flood basin, an ancient geological bowl carved by the Nile's seasonal swells over thousands of years. Water floods it, retreats, and leaves behind thick layers of silt and clay, undisturbed and untouched. It is not land suited for farming, nor has it been transformed for modern development. That, perhaps, is exactly why it has managed to hide what lies beneath. Within this seemingly insignificant terrain, modern instruments have begun to detect what the naked eye cannot. Ground-penetrating radar and high-resolution satellite imagery have revealed something deeply unexpected. Patterns. Clear, angular formations buried beneath the surface, shapes too symmetrical, too organized to be dismissed as chance. Some resemble rectangular outlines, Others seem aligned to the cardinal directions. These are not natural scatterings of stone. They resemble foundations, structures, something designed. The geology of the region only deepens the mystery. Beneath Abu Rash lies a thick, ancient layer of clay, a material that traps moisture, resists erosion, and preserves anything buried within it for extraordinary lengths of time. Compounding this is the fluctuating groundwater table, a seasonal rhythm that creates an almost cryogenic effect. While sun-exposed monuments are weathered by sand and wind, this place acts like a sealed archive. Still, quiet, preserved. And then there are the erosion marks. Researchers have pointed out features that do not match patterns caused by modern river flow or desert winds. Deep vertical grooves, rounded surfaces, segmented curves, these do not form randomly. They echo the telltale signs of human hands, of ancient carving worn by time. Sediment samples in the area date back to the early Holocene, a time when Egypt was not yet a desert, when the Sahara was green, and the Nile ran wild and free, overflowing with memory and mystery. If these shapes are artificial, if these formations are not tricks of geology but remnants of architecture, then Abu Rash is more than an overlooked marsh. It could be the missing page between Egypt's pre-dynastic past and a sacred era that has no written name. This place, long silenced by mud and obscured by reeds, might not be empty at all. It might be the very place where history waits to be remembered. And in that waiting, it offers a challenge, not to discover something new, but to recognize what has always been there. Few topics in modern archaeology ignite debate quite like the question circling the so-called underwater sphinx. Is it a natural formation, or something far more deliberate, something man-made? The battle lines are drawn between two worlds. On one side, traditional Egyptologists and geologists. On the other, independent researchers, unaffiliated scientists, and seekers of lost knowledge. The argument is not just about rock and erosion, it is about worldview, authority, and the right to question what we think we know. The mainstream academic position is clear. According to conventional geologists and Egyptologists, the structure near Abu Rash is almost certainly a natural formation. A weathered outcrop of limestone, shaped over thousands of years by the rise and fall of floodwaters, buried in silt, subjected to seasonal erosion. They point out that there are no hieroglyphs, no tools, no carved symbols, no fragments of infrastructure, none of the standard markers that traditionally accompany a confirmed archaeological site. Without these, they argue, there is no reason to believe that the shape is anything more than an illusion created by nature. From a geological standpoint, symmetry is not rare. Wind, water, and gravity can, under the right conditions, carve surprising forms. Perfect curves, balanced contours, even formations that mimic faces, limbs, or architecture. Traditionalists often invoke the face on Mars as a cautionary tale, a naturally occurring rock formation that, in low-resolution photos, resembled a human face. Higher-quality imaging later proved it was just shadows on stone. To them, the underwater sphinx is just another pareidolia, the human brain projecting meaning onto chaos. But the opposing camp isn't convinced. Independent researchers argue that technology tells a different story. Satellite imagery, sonar scans, and ground-penetrating radar reveal too much precision to dismiss. Bilateral symmetry across the shoulders, foundation-like rectangles, smooth curves that follow geometric logic. They insist that these elements aren't random, but reflect design, conscious, intelligent design. More importantly, they question why the mainstream seems so reluctant to investigate. They raise the uncomfortable possibility that institutions may be suppressing inquiry, not for lack of data, but for fear of disruption. If the underwater sphinx were proven to be man-made and older than the Great Pyramid, it would shatter established timelines, challenge the origins of Egyptian civilization, and threaten the prestige of entire academic structures. For a nation whose identity and economy are closely tied to its archaeological narrative, such a revelation could be destabilizing. Some go further, suggesting that this avoidance is not just bureaucratic caution but a strategic silence. They call for transparency, for a public excavation supervised by independent bodies. They argue that unorthodox ideas are not inherently wrong, and that science should follow evidence, not consensus. What emerges is not just a debate about stone, but a deeper tension between preservation and exploration, between institutional caution and intellectual curiosity. One side demands irrefutable proof before rewriting history. The other believes some histories cannot be revealed without first daring to question the narrative. And so the underwater Sphinx remains where it always has, buried, between the two poles of conviction, between caution and courage, between what we accept and what we might be forced to reconsider if we dared to dig. In ancient Egypt, few symbols carry as much layered meaning as the Sphinx, an icon that merges the raw power of the animal kingdom with the calculated will of the human mind. With the body of a lion and the head of a man, the Sphinx is not merely a sculpture. It is a theological statement in stone. The lion's form represents dominance, physical strength, the wild force of nature itself. The human face, often modeled after royalty, reflects reason, command, and divine rulership. Together, they portray the ideal, a king who does not conquer through brute strength alone, but by wisdom and sacred authority. The Sphinx stands as a boundary figure, guarding the space where the earthly meets the eternal, where men speak to gods. Nowhere is this symbolism more powerfully embodied than in the Great Sphinx of Giza. Carved directly from a single massive limestone outcrop, it stretches 73 meters in length and rises 20 meters high. Its gaze is fixed eternally to the east, watching for the sunrise, the daily rebirth of the sun god. Positioned as sentinel to the funerary complex, particularly that of Pharaoh Khafre, according to mainstream theory, it serves not only as a protector of tombs but as a beacon of the divine cycle of life, death, and renewal. Associated with sun deities like Ra and Horus, the Giza Sphinx affirms its creator's divine legitimacy and cosmic alignment. But if another Sphinx lies buried beneath the mud near Abu Rash, the narrative shifts dramatically. What if this submerged figure predates the dynastic period entirely? What if it is not a replica but the prototype, the original embodiment of an idea later canonized at Giza? Such a possibility raises profound questions. It implies that the concept of the Sphinx did not originate with Khafre, but with a forgotten culture that revered this hybrid form for ritual or astronomical purposes. It opens the door to an entire symbolic system that predates the written word. Egyptian architecture is rich with pairs and symmetry. Twin obelisks, double statues, and lion-lined avenues. What if the twin guardians we never knew existed were the Great Sphinx and its underwater counterpart, lost in time, but once standing in sacred dialogue across the desert and the Nile? If true, the submerged Sphinx is not just an archaeological curiosity, it is the missing half of a cosmic pair. A silent echo of a civilization that once understood the power of stone not only as structure, but as language. A language we are only beginning to hear again. The underwater Sphinx, whether carved by hands or shaped by time, is no longer just a submerged form in muddy water. It has become something more, a mirror held up to our collective memory. Even without official excavation, it has stirred a deep and unsettling curiosity. It has transformed into a living metaphor for the forgotten, the obscured, the silenced parts of our story. It is not merely about stone. It is about the weight of what we no longer see. In many ways, the Sphinx beneath the Nile has come to resemble the deep memory of humankind. Still there, but buried beneath layers of silt and centuries. It does not speak, but it persists. It does not move, but it waits. In its silence, it whispers. Through eroded lines and hidden geometry, it tells a story we are just beginning to remember. A story not written in textbooks, but felt in intuition, in wonder, in the ache of absence. This sense of hidden truth touches a wound older than empires. The truth that everything we build, we may also lose. Civilizations collapse. Languages die. Even dreams carved into granite can be washed away by sand, water, and time. We like to believe we live above the ruins, but more often we live within them, blind to their presence. How much have we forgotten in our pursuit of progress? How many mysteries lie just beneath our feet, unnoticed because we've stopped looking down? The underwater Sphinx challenges more than Egyptology. It asks a question of all of us. History is not linear. It is not a clean timeline, but a fragmented scroll, torn, rewritten, missing pages. Some chapters have been erased. Others never made it to ink. And this monument, real or imagined, forces a reckoning. Do we only believe in what has been proven? Or are we allowed to believe in what is still hidden, still unconfirmed, but undeniably resonant? More than archaeology, this becomes a matter of perception, a reflection of our own limits, a test of our humility. The Sphinx under the water may be telling us that the earliest parts of our human story are not lost, but only buried, and that perhaps we've been walking across them all along. It reminds us that history is not closed. It is still unfolding, not just in mud and stone, but in myth, in memory, and in the silent places within ourselves that still believe something sacred may be waiting to be found. The underwater Sphinx may never be unearthed. That is the bitter truth. Between cautious academia and tightly guarded national narratives, the chances of an official excavation grow slimmer with each passing year. Bureaucratic hurdles stack high. Permits, politics, preservation. And underneath it all lies a quieter resistance. The fear that what rests beneath the mud may not align with what we've been taught to believe. Not because it's false, but because it's inconvenient. But perhaps its power lies not in revelation, but in provocation. The underwater Sphinx is more than a mystery. It is a test, a challenge to our imagination, to the boundaries we place around curiosity. It dares to ask, what qualifies as truth? When do questions deserve attention, even if the answers are buried? Between fact and forgotten lies a fragile line, and this monument, silent and sunken, stands on it. It reflects something deeply human, a discomfort with the unknown, and a longing to make peace with it. Maybe that's why it unsettles us. Maybe it is not the mud or the stone we fear, but the mirror it holds up, showing us how much we've forgotten, how much we choose not to see. Still, the Sphinx whispers, not loudly, not to all, but to those willing to listen. Not with proof, but with presence. There are no lights, no signs, no final verdicts, and yet it endures, waiting, watching, not to confirm or to deny, but to invite us to wonder, to reach further, to dig, not just into the ground, but into ourselves. Because in the end, it may not matter if the Sphinx is real. What matters is that it made us look again. And in an age drowning in answers, that spark of sacred curiosity might just be the most important thing we have left. And Bullen did not come into the world wearing a crown or commanding armies. She was not born into a royal house, nor did she carry the kind of bloodline that opened palace gates. Her father, Thomas Bullen, was a skilled and ambitious diplomat who served in the courts of Europe, but his status alone was not enough to elevate his daughter into the heart of power. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, came from a noble family, yet even the prestigious Howard name could not guarantee a future near the throne. In the grand design of Tudor society, Anne's birth barely caused a ripple. And yet, from these humble beginnings, something extraordinary began to take root. From a young age, Anne was sent abroad, first to the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, a place known for elegance, education, and cultural refinement. There, Anne absorbed the courtly ways, the value of grace, and the subtleties of European diplomacy. But it was in France, in the refined circles of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, where Anne's transformation truly began. Immersed in the brilliance of the French Renaissance, she was shaped by ideas that few English girls could even name. She witnessed the rise of humanist thought, the sharp minds of women who challenged silence with wit, and the delicate yet dangerous games of courtly influence, and returned to England speaking fluent French, skilled in music, dance, conversation, and philosophy. More than that, she returned with a presence, polished, confident, and utterly unlike the English ladies she stood beside. She did not possess conventional beauty, even her admirers admitted that, but she was magnetic. Her dark eyes held a sharp gleam of intelligence. Her voice, smooth and measured, carried power. Her movements, precise and purposeful, hinted at ambition cloaked beneath courtly charm. She did not just enter rooms. She altered them. And in a world where a woman's destiny was often sealed by birth or marriage, and refused to vanish quietly. She returned not merely as Thomas Bullen's daughter, but as a force the court had never seen before. After years abroad, Anne Boleyn returned to England not as a forgotten girl, but as a woman transformed by the elegance and intellect of European courts. She was soon appointed as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, the devout and dignified wife of King Henry VIII. Though her role was officially that of a court attendant, it did not take long for Anne's presence to be felt far beyond her title. She spoke with clarity and wit, bold yet refined. Her elegance bore the unmistakable polish of France. She moved through court life not as one seeking favor, but as someone already worthy of it. She understood poetry, theology, and even politics, subjects often considered too lofty for women in Tudor England. Unlike many women in court who bent themselves into pleasantries and quiet charm to catch the king's eye and did not reach for attention, she stood apart not by demanding the room but by simply being herself. She was not flirtatious, not overly familiar, and not naive. She did not openly vie for power, yet it clung to her like a second skin. Her independence was not loud, but it was undeniable. And Henry noticed. The king, a man surrounded by compliant beauties and flattered daily into boredom, found in Anne something utterly unfamiliar. She teased with intelligence, answered him with precision, and offered no submission. What captivated him was not merely her looks, but the game she played, a game of restraint, challenge, and calculated silence. And never chased him, and that made him chase her. The court buzzed. Noble women whispered behind gloved hands. Some called her a witch who had ensnared the king. Others, more quietly, admired her bold defiance of tradition. And had no title, no official power, yet she commanded influence as if she were born to it. She did not beg to be seen. She simply refused to be invisible. And in a world built to reward obedience, it was her refusal to be conquered that made her truly dangerous. She had not yet touched the crown, but already Anne Boleyn was shaking the palace. After months of letters, conversations, and subtle exchanges, King Henry VIII made his intentions unmistakably clear. He wanted Anne, not as his wife but as his mistress. In the world of Tudor politics, this was not a shameful offer. Quite the opposite. To be the king's mistress was, for many, a golden path to influence, wealth, and elevation. Several women had taken that path and been handsomely rewarded. It was a familiar arrangement in the corridors of power, an unspoken tradition wrapped in jewels and silks. But Anne Boleyn was not like the others. She did not soften her stance or feign coyness. She did not pretend confusion. She answered plainly, shockingly, and with words that sent ripples through every hall of court. "If your majesty wishes to honor me, then marry me. I will not be mistress to any man, even a king." It was not just a refusal. It was a declaration of self-worth, unprecedented for a woman of her position. In one sentence, Anne flipped the rules of power. She refused a place that others would have fought for. And more than that, she gave the king a condition. In an era where men chose and women obeyed, Anne stood her ground. She demanded marriage or nothing at all. The court reeled. Some called her arrogant. Others whispered she was foolish to challenge the king. But a few silently recognized the brilliance behind the boldness. And was not reckless. She was playing a game only the boldest dared to play, and she was playing it well. Henry was not insulted. He was enthralled. The more she resisted, the more he pursued. What began as desire became obsession. He no longer wanted her in the shadows. He wanted her beside him on the throne. But there was one problem. He already had a queen, Catherine of Aragon, beloved by the people and protected by her powerful nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. And the Pope? He would not permit a divorce. What started as a personal proposal became a national crisis. And simple refusal lit the fuse that would explode into a religious and political revolution. She did not win the king with beauty. She won him with boundaries. And in doing so, she forced the monarchy to make a choice between love and legacy, between tradition and transformation. For years, King Henry VIII had lived in a dutiful marriage with Queen Catherine of Aragon. But Catherine, though loyal and virtuous, had failed to give him what he desired most: a son. After several pregnancies and only one surviving daughter, Henry's hope for a male heir began to wither. His concern was not simply emotional, it was dynastic. Without a son, the future of the Tudor lineage was uncertain. By the time Anne Boleyn entered his life, Henry's affections for Catherine had grown cold, and, with her intellect, independence, and refusal to become anything less than queen, ignited something deeper than desire. She set a condition, and Henry was determined to meet it. He would divorce Catherine and marry Anne. But such a decision, in Tudor England, was not a private matter. It was a religious one and immensely political. The problem lay with the church. Catherine had once been married to Henry's older brother, Arthur. Though that marriage had been brief and, according to her, unconsummated, Henry claimed it made their union invalid in the eyes of God. He insisted that their marriage was cursed, that his lack of a son was divine punishment. But the Pope, Clement VII, refused to annul it. The refusal was not simply theological, it was political. Catherine's nephew was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Europe. To grant Henry's request would mean offending the emperor and setting a dangerous precedent: that papal blessings could be reversed at a king's convenience. Frustrated and humiliated, Henry made a decision that would fracture centuries of religious unity. He severed ties with Rome. In 1534, through the Act of Supremacy, he declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. The Pope's authority was nullified. Monasteries were dissolved. Lands were seized. Dissenters like Thomas More were imprisoned or executed. What had begun as a personal pursuit now erupted into national upheaval. A king's desire became a kingdom's rupture. Henry's love for Anne Boleyn had triggered far more than a scandal. It had launched the English Reformation, realigning the religious, legal, and political soul of the nation. And at the center of it all stood Anne, not yet crowned, but already reshaping England's history. In January 1533, after secretly marrying Anne Boleyn, King Henry VIII acted swiftly to make her position official. Just months later, in June, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The coronation was no ordinary affair. It was meant to assert the legitimacy of their union, a public declaration that Anne was now not just the king's choice, but England's queen. The crown placed on her head was anointed with sacred oil, a right once reserved for monarchs themselves. Yet the joy inside the palace did not reflect the mood beyond its walls. Among the English people, Anne was not embraced. In their eyes, Queen Catherine still held the place of honor. She had been their queen for nearly 2 decades, a woman known for her dignity, her loyalty, and her unwavering presence in the hearts of the nation. To many, Anne was not a new beginning, but a disruption. A woman who had intruded into a marriage blessed by the church and torn apart the sacred fabric of order and morality. Whispers turned to slogans. Graffiti appeared on walls. Voices rose in the market squares. The king's whore and the usurper. They did not shout for joy. They muttered curses under their breath. Within the court, the tension was no less palpable. Many nobles still favored Catherine, some out of loyalty, others out of fear of foreign retaliation. Though they bowed to and in public, they mocked her in private. Her bloodline, her past, her presence, they questioned it all. She wore the crown, but not the respect. And behind all eyes was one unspoken expectation: bear a son. No one cared for romance or royal declarations. All that mattered now was Anne's womb. Could she succeed where Catherine had failed? Could she secure the dynasty? And ruled in name, but in truth she walked a tightrope, alone, watched, and under siege. Never before had a queen been so visible, yet so unwanted. She had won the throne, but not the hearts, and the cost of that absence would soon come due. In 16th century England, the highest calling of a queen was singular and unforgiving: produce a male heir. For Anne Boleyn, this expectation was not just tradition, it was survival. Her marriage to Henry VIII had defied the church, broken with Rome, and ignited a national crisis. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, Anne held no royal blood, no long-standing claim to legitimacy. Her position rested entirely on the king's favor and the hope of a son. That hope seemed to take root quickly. In 1533, just months after their secret wedding, Anne announced she was pregnant. The news swept through court like a divine sign. Henry rejoiced, confident that their union had been justified. Ministers, nobles, even foreign ambassadors looked to the unborn child as the key to stabilizing the new royal order. Anne's womb became the symbol of the Tudor future. On September 7, 1533, Anne gave birth. But it was not a boy. It was a girl. They named her Elizabeth. Though Henry smiled for the public, disappointment flickered beneath the surface. He needed a son to secure the Tudor legacy. Behind closed doors, whispers grew louder. Anne had failed. Superstition crept in. Some called it an omen, others a punishment from heaven for the king's defiance of the Pope. Still, Anne tried again. In 1534, she became pregnant once more, but the pregnancy ended early. In 1536, she conceived again, but tragically miscarried after hearing that Henry had been gravely injured in a jousting accident. A loss that shook her to the core. Each miscarriage chipped away at her foundation. The love that had lifted her to the throne began to erode. Henry's patience thinned. The court, once divided, started leaning away. The whispers became murmurs. God does not bless this marriage. And then, quietly, another figure stepped forward. Jane Seymour. Demure, silent, everything and was not. The king's eyes began to shift. And Boleyn had wagered everything on the promise of a son. But fate had other plans. And in a court where power was inherited through blood, love was never enough. Thomas Cromwell had once stood beside Anne Boleyn, an ally in reform, a strategist who helped dismantle Catherine's marriage and pave the path to Anne's queenship. Together, they had challenged Rome and reshaped the Church of England. But power rarely shares its throne for long. As Anne grew bolder in her role, tensions began to rise. She believed in using the Church's seized wealth to help the poor, stripping the greedy aristocracy of their excess. Cromwell, ever the pragmatist, preferred alliances with the nobility. He saw Anne's vision not as noble, but as dangerous. In time, the cracks widened. What was once cooperation became quiet hostility. And soon, Cromwell no longer saw her as a partner, but as a threat. At the same time, a new figure stepped into view. Jane Seymour, gentle, silent, obedient, the perfect counterpoint to Anne's fire. Where Anne had challenged, Jane complied. Where Anne had spoken boldly, Jane held her tongue. She offered no opinions, only soft eyes and lowered lashes. Henry, weary from disappointment, noticed, and had just suffered a devastating miscarriage in 1536. Her health was fragile, her spirit worn. And in that weakness, Henry began to drift. The love that had once broken kingdoms now faded into silence. The king no longer wrote. He no longer defended her. His time went to Jane. And behind that silence grew calculation. Cromwell watched and acted. Anne's enemies, long quiet, began to stir. Nobles who had remained neutral now whispered against her. Supporters of Catherine saw a chance for revenge. Courtiers, weary of Anne's influence, fed the growing rumors. The court became a forest of shadows, soft footsteps, half-heard accusations, eyes that turned away too quickly. What Anne once ruled, she now merely endured. She had not only lost the king's heart, she had gained the attention of men who knew how to destroy queens. Not with swords, but with silence, structure, and scandal. The walls were closing in, and Anne Boleyn, once the storm that shook the palace, was becoming its target. Thomas Cromwell had made his choice. Once an ally to Anne Boleyn, he now saw her as an obstacle to be removed. With the king's favor shifting toward Jane Seymour, Cromwell understood the tides, and he moved swiftly. To secure his own power, appease the court, and offer Henry a clean escape, Cromwell began constructing the deadliest weapon in any palace: a narrative. He built a case from shadows, and, he claimed, had committed adultery with multiple men, among them courtiers, servants, even a court musician. More scandalous still, he accused her of incest, alleging a relationship with her own brother, George Boleyn. And beyond betrayal of marriage, she was charged with treason, conspiring to kill the king and seize the throne. It was theater disguised as law. The timelines did not align. The supposed encounters defied logic. Witnesses contradicted one another. Some were tortured. Others were promised rewards. The accusations were stitched together with hearsay, fear, and the quiet coercion of those who knew resistance would cost their lives. Modern historians agree. There was no real evidence, only an illusion of justice wrapped around a pre-written sentence. And Henry, the man who had once rewritten the laws of heaven for Anne, now refused to look her in the eye. He did not ask for explanation. He did not demand truth. Whether it was boredom, bitterness, or the lure of Jane Seymour, Henry embraced the lies. Perhaps he believed them, perhaps he wanted to, but in that moment love vanished, replaced by cold calculation. When Anne was arrested, she still believed he would intervene. She had been his queen, the mother of his child, the woman for whom he had defied the church itself. But all she received was silence. She was locked in the Tower of London, isolated, barred from speaking publicly, denied contact with her daughter. Those she trusted had been imprisoned or vanished into cautious silence. The court had made its decision, and Boleyn was not undone by war or rebellion. She was broken by design, by whispered accusations, choreographed betrayal, and the silence of the man who had once torn down a kingdom for her. In this game of power, love had no place, and became its most tragic casualty. On May 15, 1536, Anne Boleyn was brought to trial inside the walls of the Tower of London. The court that awaited her was not one of justice, but of theater. 26 peers of the realm sat in judgment. Many of them men who had once bowed before her, accepted her favor, and risen under her reign as queen. Presiding over the trial was Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, the king's own uncle. His role was clear: execute the crown's will without hesitation and without mercy, and was not allowed legal counsel. She was forced to defend herself, alone, against charges as heavy as they were fantastical. She did not flinch, and stood before her accusers and dismantled their arguments with intelligence and clarity. She refuted timelines, exposed inconsistencies, and challenged the credibility of witnesses who had been tortured or coerced. She affirmed her loyalty to the king and to England. She pleaded for justice, not as a queen begging for favor, but as a woman demanding truth. Contemporary accounts recorded the awe in the courtroom. Even her enemies could not deny her brilliance. But admiration did not change destiny. The verdict was already written, and was found guilty of treason, adultery, and incest, each accusation enough on its own to sentence her to death. The original penalty was brutal, to be burned alive or hanged. But Henry, in a final gesture dressed as mercy, granted a nobler death, execution by sword rather than axe. Her brother George Boleyn, accused of incest, was condemned alongside her. For other men, named as her supposed lovers, were also convicted, most of them broken by torture or silenced with bribes. The trial was no search for truth. It was a public ritual designed to sanctify Anne's removal from both crown and life. There was no appeal, no review, no doubt allowed to rise above the whisper of politics. Anne understood this. She had lost the king. She had lost the court. And now, she had lost the game she once played with mastery. But she had not lost her dignity. In the end, Anne Boleyn would not be remembered as a guilty woman, but as a queen who stood with unshaken grace, even as the scaffold waited. Henry VIII arranged for an executioner to be brought from France, a man known for his skill with the sword. It was considered a final act of mercy, a privilege reserved for nobility, swifter and cleaner than the crude English axe. Yet behind the gesture lay strategy, to present the king not as cruel, but as composed, measured, and merciful, even as he ended the life of the woman he once moved heaven and earth to marry, and accepted her fate with the same poise that had once captivated a kingdom. On the morning of her execution, she dressed with intention. A simple gray gown, a modest coif to cover her dark hair, no jewels, no ornamentation. She stepped forward not as a disgraced queen, but as a figure of solemn grace. Her silence became her final crown, before the sword was raised, and spoke, not in bitterness, but in reverence. She offered no blame, no protest. Instead, she prayed for the king's prosperity, wished him a long and peaceful reign, and expressed hope that her death might bring peace to the realm. The crowd fell silent. Her final words, spoken with unwavering composure, etched her into the memory of all who stood there, not as a traitor, but as a queen of dignity and spirit. Anne's body was laid to rest in an unmarked grave within the grounds of the Tower. But her legacy could not be buried. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would one day ascend the throne. The child once dismissed for being the wrong gender would become one of the greatest monarchs England had ever known. Elizabeth I ruled for 44 years, ushering in an era of strength, artistry, and power, reflecting the brilliance of the mother she barely knew, and had changed the course of a nation. Through her, the Church of England was born. Through her, the role of women in power was redefined. Through her daughter, her flame endured, and Boleyn died alone, but her story did not end there. Her name, her voice, and her blood lived on, not in whispers, but in history's unending echo. She did not vanish. She became legend,